I think that everybody was surprised when they announced Elden Ring Night Rain, partly because they'd hinted that they were not going to make a sequel to Elden Ring, and partly because this game is just kind of weird. They're taking inspiration from Fortnite of all things, adding a range of battle royale mechanics like a ring that shrinks over time. This has sparked quite a lot of debate online. People are worrying, is this too big a change? Is this still going to keep the things I like about Elden Ring? Are they just jumping on a bandwagon by trying to sort of smush Fortnite mechanics into their game? And is it just a cynical asset flip where they take all the work they put into Elden Ring previously, stuff it into a new package and sell it to you twice? People are concerned, and hey, I think that's entirely reasonable. But personally, I'm actually really excited for Night Rain. I think this game could be really, really cool. And that's because I think that it looks like it's going to fix what I consider to be the biggest design flaw in the original Elden Ring. And before I explain what that is, let me just caveat this by saying that Elden Ring has a design flaw. I am not saying that it's a bad game. It's a really good game. It has an enormous world to explore with tons of content. It's very atmospheric and has a real sense of place and uniqueness. You can see just from the background footage here how evocative this world is. And on top of that, of course, it has a lot of challenge to keep people invested over a long time. And it is a large game that, for me, took over 80 hours to beat for the first time. So it's great value for money as well. There's a lot of things that Elden Ring did very right. But I also think that there is a flaw within the game that is stopping it from being the best possible version of itself. And I think this flaw is going to be addressed by Night Rain. Here's the issue. All of the past games in the series, and by this series I mean Dark Souls most particularly, but also Demon Souls, Bloodborne and Sekiro, all of those games, they're all based around these sort of tightly designed, linear, maze-like levels, where they've put specific enemies and specific locations to sort of jump out at you and pose a very carefully calibrated level of challenge, which is calibrated to be very difficult and perhaps even a little bit unfair, but not so difficult that it's just frustrating and you give up. On the other hand, Elden Ring is shifting into an open world, a huge open world with vast, sprawling areas that are so big you need a horse to travel across them, which is completely different to the Dark Souls experience. And while yes, the game does incorporate some of these more tightly designed maze-like areas, they're only a minority of the game's overall content. And this is where we get to the flaw I'm talking about, because open world mechanics tend to conflict with traditional action RPG elements. When we think about an open world, we often think about games like Skyrim, or the more recent Zelda games, or maybe The Witcher 3. And there's a lot of different mechanics in these games that are just very different to Dark Souls and to Elden Ring. By contrast, in Elden Ring they've gone and taken a lot of the mechanics from Dark Souls 3 and transplanted them almost identically and unchanged into Elden Ring, without, I think, always fully considering how well those mechanics are going to work in an open world. Because ultimately, open world games just require different systems for progression and balance in particular. So let's try and make this a bit more specific and dive into some detail here. The game's leveling up and character building system is, as I just said, lifted from Dark Souls 3 with only minor tweaks. And personally, in my opinion, leveling up has never really been the strongest part of the Dark Souls games. It certainly isn't the reason why I would be excited to play a new Dark Souls game. It's more just a system that you have to deal with to progress. And if we look at how it works, you have these 8 stats that you can invest in that all have some weird names like Vigor or Arcane, and right off the bat that poses some problems, especially for new players, because how are you supposed to divide your skill points between all these stats. It's a lot of stats and you don't really get that many skill points, and it really does matter a great deal how you divide your points. There's a lot of expert knowledge needed to build a character well, and there's even gotchas in this system because half of these stats exist pretty much only to prevent you from using certain items. For example, if you want to use a really heavy greatsword, then you're going to need enough points invested in strength to carry it. And similarly, if you want to use a particular magic spell, you're going to need enough points in intelligence, or perhaps also faith and arcane, depending on what kind of spell it is. And once you've put enough stats in to use these items, often the best thing to do is just pack loads of points into Vigor, which gives you HP, since a lot of HP makes the game a lot more manageable to play. So when you put all of this together, you have this somewhat overwhelming character building system with a lot of stats on the screen, a lot of numbers that are a bit confusing, and often the most optimal way to build your character is to reverse engineer the game. First, decide what weapons you're going to want to use in the endgame, and then work backwards to figure out what stats you want to invest in. And this working backwards means that players are encouraged to use a wiki, which, of course, might also reveal spoilers for the rest of the game, so I feel like it's just really not an ideal system. And it's ironic because the game that they released before Elden Ring was Sekiro: Shadows Die Twice, and in this game, it has, in my opinion, a far superior character building system. The way it works is that every time you beat a major boss, there's something like 10 major bosses in the game, and every time you beat one, you get more attack power. On the other hand, every time you beat 4 mini-bosses, you get more health, and therefore the game designer can track the player's progress based on the number of bosses they've encountered, and because the game is quite linear, you know roughly how many bosses they will have encountered at any given point in time. And this allows them to balance the game around that knowledge. On top of this, instead of getting stat boosts when you level up, you instead get skill points. And these skill points can be spent in a big skill tree. In fact, you have 4 different skill trees. And it lets you freely choose additional abilities for your ninja. Things like improving your shurikens, or your counters, or your stamina usage. Things like that, where you're actually gaining discrete abilities as you level up, rather than purely raising your health by 2%. This means that you can't really do the leveling up wrong in Sekiro. You can get pretty much everything eventually, and you're not going to lock yourself out of using fun mechanics. However, Elden Ring doesn't have Sekiro's level up system, it has Dark Souls' level up system. But I have to say, when I was playing Dark Souls, I didn't mind it that much. I think that this level up system is made a lot worse in Elden Ring because of the addition of the open world. And that's because all of these games are based on finely tuned, difficult challenges. And that's because the feeling that the game is trying to evoke in the player is the feeling of overcoming an extreme challenge that you previously thought was impossible. And so a lot of care has to be put into the balancing of each game that they make. It's extremely important. The problem is, in an open world, you can tackle the game's content in any order. And this means that the player could become massively stronger or massively weaker than the designer expected, depending on the order in which they tackle the content in the game. And if you can't predict the player's level and their health and their damage, then you can't possibly hope to balance it so tightly. Games like Skyrim and Zelda solve this problem by making the enemies in the world level up alongside the player. So if you're a level 12 explorer in Skyrim, the enemies that you fight are probably going to be between level 10 and level 14. And similarly in Zelda, as you collect more heart pieces, the strength of the enemies in the world increase, and this is shown by the number of them and also the colour of them. But this solution isn't really right for a Dark Souls game, and that's because it takes away any sort of objective standard of how difficult a particular challenge is. The difficulty of each challenge just arbitrarily scales up with the player's progress. And I think that's the reason why they didn't go for this approach, and instead they chose a simpler solution of saying, okay, each part of the world, whether that's Limgrave or Liurnia or Caelid, has a particular expected level range and therefore a particular difficulty. And we sort of anticipate the player's going to do it roughly in this order, and so a majority of the game's content will be roughly balanced okay. And this solution is fine, but it does mean that if you don't 100% an area before you move on, then when you come back to it later, you'll be massively over-leveled and you'll just crush all of the bosses within it without too much trouble. And I think that can be quite deflating in a game that's ultimately all about the overcoming of challenge. There's also a second and related point of conflict in the game's design, and that is that open world exploration games are all about discovery. The open world is an invitation to explore it, and the discoveries that you make are the payoff for your exploration. And Elden Ring has a very expansive world, with a lot to explore, a lot to find, and I do think that some of the most rewarding things you do in that game are when you delve deep through a dungeon and you come out through the other side and you discover that you've created a shortcut, or you've reached a new area on top of a mountain that you've always been looking at but never were quite able to reach. The game does sometimes link up and around and over itself in that way. But most of the time, when you complete a dungeon, the reward that you get is a piece of gear. And the problem with this is that most of the gear in the game is unequipable. As we talked about earlier, the stat system that you use to build your character exists primarily to stop your player from equipping almost all gear in the game. And this means that the payoff for completing that dungeon can just be entirely missing. On top of this, even if you get gear that you can equip, you still need a lot of materials to upgrade it. You need all these different smithing stones, and you need smithing stones of particular sizes as well. Especially in the early and mid game, this can be a real pain, and it disincentivizes players from switching out their weapons and their gear even further. So when you find gear in Elden Ring, it often just sucks. It reminds you of all the choices you didn't make, all of the things that your character can't try, because you're locked into a single build. And in Dark Souls, I feel like the system wasn't as bad because ultimately those games were quite short, especially once you beat them once, you could replay them in a single-digit number of hours. In fact, Sekiro I've been able to beat in pretty much a single sitting before. And since the game is so short, I think this idea of locking you into a particular build of character makes a lot more sense and feels a lot better, because you can try out this one character for a number of hours and then you can switch it up and try something different. But Elden Ring is several times longer than Dark Souls, and so replaying it is a much bigger time investment. And also, most of the game's content is skippable, and most of the rewards that you find can't be equipped by you whatever you build, so why would you bother doing all of those dungeons? In Dark Souls, you're forced to do most of the content because it's a linear game, and that makes you adapt and makes you overcome it. But in Elden Ring, there's this sort of tension of, well, how much of the content should I actually do? How many things should I skip? And again, you have to sort of check the wiki to figure out where in this enormous world all of the items you need for your particular build are resting. And all of this comes together to make Elden Ring just a lot less replayable than Dark Souls, and that ultimately I think is the game's major flaw. A lot of these problems I didn't find as much of an issue on the first playthrough, because I was still exploring this world and finding new areas, and that was fun in and of itself. But once that's done and you're going into your repeat playthroughs and you're now focusing on the game's core gameplay and character building mechanics, it starts to fall apart, in my opinion. And some people would call this kind of system build diversity, because you have a wide range of choices on how you build your character. But personally, I don't think I'd call it that. In a game like Monster Hunter, you can change your equipment at any time, or at least at the start of a hunt, which means that you can choose a weapon more suited to a particular monster, like using a bow against a monster that can fly. And you can also choose armor and weapons that have synergizing effects to help you resist the monster. And in my opinion, that's true build diversity, because you keep expanding over time on the range of different builds that you can use in that game. And I think I'd consider Elden Ring to be the opposite of this, more of a build prison that locks the player in it based on some extremely early decisions. Now, as I said earlier, I think that Night Rain is a really creative and inventive way of sidestepping these problems, and I'm pretty excited for it. But before we talk about the very inventive way that Night Rain is switching things up, let's first just think about a more traditional way that you could solve this problem, because it absolutely is possible to merge the action RPG gameplay of a game like Dark Souls with an open world in a way that's harmonious. The simplest way, the way that I would probably tackle it, is to use super effective weaknesses and resistances, sort of copying Pokemon. So to give an example of that, let's say you have an icy region of the map, and in this region the players are going to need, at a minimum, some warm clothing and maybe also a fiery weapon to sort of melt the enemy ice monsters. And on top of this, you could have additional tools like icy shields or potions, or hey, maybe like snowshoes that let you walk on snow faster. There's all sorts of things you could do. You could get really creative with it. And the more gear that you have that helps you in this area, the better you're going to do, and the deeper you'll be able to get into the area, and you'll be able to fight the harder bosses of that area. To give another quick example, you could have a poisonous swamp, because there's always a poisonous swamp in these games, and maybe you need some like Wellington boots to sort of keep your feet out of the swamp water. Or you need the proper kinds of medicine, maybe even a few different kinds of medicine. And there could also be, catacombs where you've got to bring holy weapons into the catacombs, or the enemies will keep regenerating. There's all sorts of things you could do. I'm sure you could come up with a dozen examples yourself of ways you could sort of inject super effective weaknesses and strengths on all sorts of different gears, items, locations, enemies. It's very fertile ground from a game design perspective. And the reason why I'd focus on this is it really gives you the best of both worlds. On the one hand, you can make the game a lot harder for players that are unprepared, because they'll be going into an environment where the odds are really stacked against them. And if you're a sort of a challenge player who likes to beat the game as quickly as possible, then you could come up with all sorts of fun challenge and speed runs for yourself. Whereas on the other hand, if you're a more sort of slower and more methodical player, it gives you more abilities to prepare yourself, building up the right gear and sort of moving from area to area based on the gear that you have collected so far, and getting a little bit deeper into each of them each time. Of course, you'd also need one more adjustment made to the game, which is to let players completely change their builds at all rest points, similar to in Monster Hunter you can change armor and weapons, or similar to Armored Core, which is another From Software game where you're piloting a mecha, and before every mission you can swap out all the different individual parts on your mecha, and you're encouraged to build a variety of them for a variety of different missions that you might encounter. In other words, having this flexible gear switching, and by having a need to switch gear because there's super effective resistances and weaknesses on all of the enemies in the game, it would encourage adaptation and exploration in a much more direct way than Elden Ring currently does. So that's what I would do if I had been put in charge of making Elden Ring 2. But that is not what Night Rain does. It does something totally out of left field by shifting the game away from RPG mechanics and towards Battle Royale mechanics. But still with a twist, which is that most Battle Royale games, a traditional Battle Royale game, is PvP, where you drop a whole bunch of players into a world, they land, they fight each other, and the last man standing wins. But Night Rain is going to be PvE, where you're working with a small co-op team to defeat computer-controlled enemies. And this is smart because it gives them very tight control over the game's balancing once again. The player will be ferried from location to location using the ring and the rain. And the game will know roughly how strong the player is at each point in a round, and therefore it can throw enemies your way that have the right level of challenge. On top of this, and Just to be clear, I've not played Night Rain yet, it's not out, I don't have any special knowledge, I'm just sort of piecing all of this together based on what I've read in various interviews, so my information might be slightly inaccurate here, but from what I can tell, they have stripped away a lot of the convoluted leveling mechanics from Dark Souls, and instead of building your character point by point, you instead just pick a class at the beginning of each round. And on top of this, from the sounds of things, each round is going to only last about an hour, and that's only if you survive the whole way through, which when you compare it to the 80-hour playthrough of Elden Ring that I did, you can see that this game is going to be a lot quicker, a lot more replayable, and the randomization elements that have been sort of inspired by Battle Royale or roguelike games will help keep it fresh each time you replay. And I think when you put all of this together, the game will really incentivize players to try out new things, try and develop their skills, learn from their losses, and I think it could be a really fun, tight, replayable game. And that's why I'm really keen to give it a try when it launches. However, there is a problem with Night Rain as well, a very frustrating problem that they could have avoided very easily, but chose not to. And this is that Night Rain is going to have a solo mode, and it's going to have a co-op trios mode, but it's not going to have a duos mode. And I find this decision just so frustrating, because here's the thing. Being an adult, I don't have as much time to play games as I used to, and certainly I don't have as much time to play games as I would like to have. And the same goes for all of my friends, they're all adults now too, and they have their own schedules, and those schedules often don't align with mine. And so because of that, even getting one friend to be aligned with me so that we can play a game together is quite a rare experience. And aligning a third person's schedule with all of that is much more difficult still. And this is a problem that I had actually all the way through 2024 with Apex Legends, which is coincidentally also a battle royale game, and it had a duos mode in it for the last couple of years, until about March time, I think, of 2024, when they just decided they were going to get rid of duos. And I used to play this game all the time with my friend because it was a quick and simple game, we could play at duos, but also if a third person did happen to be available, we could bump it up to trios, and if one person had to leave, we could drop it back down to duos. It was very flexible, and it basically was just a game that fits quite well into an ordinary person's life. And since they removed the duos mode, after a while we just sort of stopped playing the game. I mean, I think they have it back in now, but at this point we've moved on, and we don't really play Apex anymore. And I was hoping that Night Rain could sort of fill this gap of being a fun little replayable battle royale game I could jump into. But I can't actually play it with my one friend who's particularly into Elden Ring, or at least not without having a random third person brought in by matchmaking. And look, people might say, hey, you know, that's not such a big deal, just deal with the third person. But because this game is going to require such tight cooperation, just as Apex Legends does, having a third person in the team that you can't really communicate with is never going to be the ideal. Now, IGN were able to ask the developers directly, why is there no duos mode in this game? And their reasoning was, they said they wanted to create a unique sense of accomplishment, and forcing the game to be 3-player only is something they haven't done before, and therefore it will create a unique sense of accomplishment. Now, putting aside the fact that the phrase "a sense of pride and accomplishment" is a meme in the online gaming space with dodgy connotations, I honestly doubt that the developers would have known this. They're Japanese speaking, so I'm not going to hold that against them. But I do think that this is pretty weak reasoning, because personally at least, I see the number of players that you can play with not as a gameplay feature, but more as an accessibility feature. Because ultimately they're asking you a question, well, how many players do you actually have to play with right now? You know, there's a reason why most board games say on them supports 2 to 8 players. It's because, you know, it has to fit into real people's lives. And it's especially baffling considering that the game does have a solos mode, so clearly they can adjust the game's difficulty based on the number of active players. They've just deliberately chosen not to do that for 2 players. And I hope that the developers reconsider and patch in the option eventually, because once again it should be easy to undo this decision. Although I'm not sitting here with my fingers crossed. Anyway, these are just my thoughts, the exciting ideas and the perhaps frustrating ideas of Night Rain. Obviously the game is not out yet, so I'm going to hold back my final judgment until I've played it. But I am very cautiously excited. I do think that this is a fresh idea, and I'm all about fresh ideas in gaming. And I think it's positive for the company. They've made a lot of similar games over the last 20 years, and it's nice to see them break out and try new things. And I suspect this isn't the last crazy new idea that they're going to surprise us with. Let me know your thoughts. Are they cooking with this one, or are they just cooked? And if you want to hear more of my game design ramblings, come back next week. I'll see you then. Thanks for watching.